This continues to rise every year. So people with disabilities represent the nation's largest minority group. Unfortunately, because we don't always see disability, people don't recognize that. People don't realize how prevalent disability is in our communities. So I'm going to use the word accessibility a lot, and accessibility can mean a lot of things. So for the context of this presentation, we're talking about document and web accessibility. So we're talking about communication access. This is just one part of communication access. The use of ASL interpreters is another example of communication access, having things in plain language. But for this, we are talking about document and web accessibility. So information materials must be accessible to all individuals, including those with disabilities. The work being done in ADA compliance and documents, typically the considerations being made are for people using assistive technology. So assistive technology can look a lot of different ways. It can be things like screen readers. So individuals who either have visual impairment, who may have a learning disability like dyslexia, individuals who may have limited mobility in their arms, they may use a software that reads aloud the screen for them. For people who are blind or visually impaired, it allows them to hear the information that they cannot see. For individuals who have conditions like dyslexia, sometimes hearing the content is a little bit easier than reading it for them. And for individuals who have mobility limitations, there can be voice commands, and that helps them move their way through their computer and their screens without having to use their arms. Assistive technology can also be things like magnifying software. So if you've ever zoomed in on a document to get a better look at something, that is an example of magnifying software. We all use it to some degree typically, but some people use it more frequently or at a higher magnitude than what we typically do. So we're going to talk about how we make our documents such so that people using these technologies and people who may have vision impairments and other type of disabilities can process our documents. Please feel free to stop me as we go. Because I have my slides up, I can't actually see you. So if you have a question that's related to the topic on the slide, feel free to just interrupt me and ask. That way, we're still in that particular content. There will be lots of time at the end though as well. So first we're going to talk about font. One thing I want to make clear up front is that for some of you, this may be information you know. For others, this may all be new content. It's a lot of information I'm gonna throw at you today. Document accessibility does not happen overnight. It's something that's going to take a little bit of time to get used to. It's going to take a little bit of time to make it your standard practice. It's also important to give yourself credit because documents were never made to be accessible. This is all typically retroactive work trying to make things accessible. So when we're talking about font, we want to use only sans serif fonts. Sans serif fonts are fonts that do not have accent marks on the end. So things like Helvetica, Arial, Tahoma, Calibri. The font on this screen, I believe, is Calibri. We want to avoid serif fonts, things like Times New Roman, Cambria, Palatino. Now, the reason for this is when somebody is using a magnifying software and they expand, or not expand, but magnify their screen, serif letters are not a continuous stroke. So it ends up very pixelated and made up of dots, which is not helpful. It makes it difficult to read it. Microsoft does a lot of work for you. It's really trying to make accessibility the default, which is why Calibri is now the new standard font as opposed to Times New Roman. So unless you have messed with the settings in your Microsoft Office, the entire Office suite, it should be Calibri. If not, though, you can certainly change that. Minimum font size needs to be 11. Some departments in the state are using 12 as the mandatory size. 11 is what's legally required. Your header needs to be significantly larger than your body text. So there's not necessarily it needs to be this size, but it needs to be noticeably larger so that someone looking at it recognizes, oh, this is a title. This is separate from the content. We want to avoid drop caps. So drop caps, if you're not familiar with what these are, when you open a book for the first time and there's that one really big letter, the very first letter of the book is big and it lines up with, 6 or 8 lines, that's a drop cap. Drop caps are not accessible because a screen reader doesn't know where in the order of reading that letter falls. Because it sits next to several words, it doesn't know which it's attached to. We want to be careful with how we use italics. Italics can be used if we're trying to emphasize a single word or a short phrase, but we don't want to use italics excessively. We don't want to use them for big blocks of text, for example. The most common times that I see this is when someone is using a larger quote and they've kind of indented the paragraph and they use italics. Italics, again, are okay in small amounts, but for many people, it's more difficult to read italics, particularly individuals with certain cognitive disabilities. It's hard to separate the letters or to identify the individual letters when something is in italics. With headers and footers, it's important to know that screen readers do not process those. Any content in your headers and footers will not be read aloud by a screen reader. So, a lot of folks, that's kind of the default of where they put their title or where they put the author name, things like that. We want to avoid doing that because the screen reader will not pick up that information. One important thing to note is that text boxes are not accessible. So of all of the things I talk about today, this is one of the things that is typically the biggest adjustment for folks to get used to. We use a lot of text boxes. What does this mean? This means we should not be using programs like Microsoft Publisher. Microsoft Publisher is not an accessible software. The only program in which text boxes are okay is PowerPoint, and I'll talk a little bit more about PowerPoint later. It means that we shouldn't be having text next to each other. So a lot of times when I see this, it's because somebody wants to have an article on the left and then an article on the right. And so they use text boxes to keep those two separate. Those are examples of things that will not be accessible. A screen reader does not identify a text box as text. So there's lots of things that we can do. If we're trying to use text boxes next to each other to have content next to each other, we can use things like columns, or if they're images, we can use things like the snipping tool to clump them together. And I can talk a little bit more about that as we go. We want to make sure that our hyperlinks are accessible. So every hyperlink should have clear descriptive text. It should describe the link's destination rather than just being the URL. We also don't want to say things that are ambiguous like click here or link or here or website. A lot of times where we just have the one word, that becomes the hyperlink. This is because when a screen reader user wants to get a list of all of the links, they can open up a directory of all of the links on the page. If all of your links are click here and they're trying to find a specific one, it's not helpful to them because they're going to scroll through and get click here, click here, click here. And they don't know which one is going to take them to the specific site or document that they're looking for. You want all of your hyperlink text to be unique so that the screen reader knows clearly which link it's on. What I mean by this is if you, for example, on your main web page, you have two different links in your document. One is taking you, I'm just making this up. I don't know if this would apply to your web page or not, but say you have a contacts page and you have like a news page, press releases, things like that. The links for those two things should not be the same. Even though they're going to the same umbrella website, because they are different web pages, those hyperlinks should be different. We see this a lot when people are referring folks to, the Michigan.gov website, or I do a lot of work with COVID right now, or the COVID webpage. If I'm sending somebody to the data page and somebody else to the epidemic order page, I don't want those links to look the same because they are going to different places. So this gives you a little bit of an example of a couple of incorrect ways to do this. So like I said, we do not want to spell out that full URL. A screen reader will read every single character in that, and it gets very confusing. We don't want to use things like click here. Instead, like within that last example, we want to have a link that describes exactly where it's going. So the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services Disability Health webpage. That tells someone exactly where it's going to take them. Now, sometimes we have documents that are available both electronically and in hard copy, and not having the hyperlink is not helpful for anybody working with that hard copy. So in those situations, we do what I have for this Google example here. We have both that unique hyperlink, and then we include the URL next to it in parentheses. So search on Google to learn more. I have Google set as a hyperlink, and then next to it I do parentheses URL and the URL. We want to label it as URL like that so that when a screen reader hits it, it knows, okay, there's going to be a string of numbers and letters that aren't going to make sense. It's because it's a URL. Now, if your link is really long, like the MDHHS one above, you can use a link shortener. We do this a lot for CDC websites because CDC website URLs tend to be very long. I use Bitly for my link shortener normally, but you know, there are lots of versions out there. This is something where I would definitely check with your communication office to make sure it's okay before you do. In MDHHS, we are allowed to do that, but I don't want to give you bad advice that's going to get you in trouble. So just make sure to check that link shortening is appropriate for the work that you're doing. So we want to be careful with how we use color. Color is really important. You know, anybody who does any work in communication or marketing knows that color can be a really powerful tool. Unfortunately, color can also be a barrier if it's not used correctly. All document backgrounds should be simple and single colored. I tell people to avoid gradients altogether. If you have to use it, do white and a very light pastel color. Don't do any gradients that start light and become dark. Those get very difficult for people's eyes. We want to avoid watermarks or background graphics or images. Screen readers do not pick up watermarks. So if you have, for example, a confidential watermark, the screen reader user isn't going to know that that's there. So if you have a watermark, things like confidential or draft, make sure that whatever that information is, it's also included in the body text of the document at the top. Someone who is not looking, but you know, processing a document that's confidential needs to know that it is. We want to avoid having background graphics or images. The general rule of thumb, you should never have text sitting on top of anything other than a plain color. So we just want to avoid that. Grayscale should be avoided in everything. If you're printing, do not print in grayscale. If you're picking color schemes for a document, do not choose grayscale. Grayscale is really hard for everyone to see, not just people with you know, significant visual limitations. You also do not want to use color as the only means of conveying information. So I have this example here on the right. So in the top one, I am indicating yes or no with just color. The X's are either red or green. Someone with color blindness is not going to be able to see the difference between those X's. So we can still use those colors, but there has to be another means of conveying the information. So in the bottom example, I'm still using red or green, but I'm also using the words yes or no. So even if something is printed in black and white, and that's a great way to check your color, how you're using color, printed in black and white, you will still get the information that I'm trying to convey. I typically recommend that everybody print things in black and white as a test or put it in a black and white view so that you can make sure that all of that information is still being conveyed. Color can also be difficult in things like charts and graphs when you have two colors next to each other. So in this example, the color is standalone. The red and the green are not touching. But sometimes a common example would be pie charts, where we have blocks of color that are right next to each other. We want to avoid that whenever possible. For things like that, we can put white divider lines or black divider lines. If we have, you know, color shapes on our document, we want to put space between them. And that's because lots of folks, not just folks with color blindness, but just people in general, have difficulty differentiating between two colors next to each other. It's more common in men than women, but it happens, for everybody, particularly red and green, which is the most common form of color blindness, but also blue and purple and red and orange. Colors that are close, they're different, but they're just close enough that it can be hard to tell the difference. So we just want to be careful and very strategic with how we use color in our documents. I'm going to talk a little bit about non-text elements. So anything that is not typed into the page, objects, images, graphics, tables, charts, smart art, shapes, any of this. There's two things that we have to do. We have to add alternative or alternate text. It depending on the program, has different names. And we want to make sure that the alignment is in line with text. So alignment is the text wrapping feature in Microsoft. So on the left, I have this picture of a panda, and it's been clicked on by the mouse. Up in the right corner next to it, you'll see this little icon. It's a square with several blue lines and a little arch running over top of them. So that is the text wrapping tool. Anytime you click on an image, it should show up. And you can click that and you want to do inline with text. The other option is to right click and this drop down window will appear. It's that middle blue shape on my screen. Ignore the arrow that's pointing to format picture. That should be up a couple, where it says wrap text. And then it'll open this secondary window in line with text. Now, typically Microsoft by default puts things in line with text. It's typically, somebody who is creating a document that comes in and changes it. So we do this when we want to put a picture next to the text that we're writing. We use that in line with text. Or when we want to put multiple images next to each other. And those are not accessible. Things need to be in line with text. And when, I'll talk a little bit how we can do things that mimic that look without actually being that. So you can still adjust the justification. You can still have it left, centered, or right justified when it's in line with text. It just has to be in line with text. And that means that every item has its own line. So an image or a table or a chart cannot share a line on the page with text. Alternative or alt text provides a description of any non-text element. So in Microsoft, all of them have some kind of format picture option at the bottom. So if you are using an older version of Microsoft, so Microsoft, I believe it is 2019 and earlier, you'll have to do it this way. You'll right click and then you'll go down to the bottom and click Format Picture. Now, most of us are probably operating on more recently updated software, in which case it will look like this, where you'll right click and there'll be an option that says Edit Alt Text. I should have prefaced this by saying that I will provide these slides for everybody and a guide on creating accessible documents. So I know that I'm tossing a lot of information at you, but I will be providing that documentation. So this opens the alt text box. And now you put a description in. Alt text does not have clear rules for what it should be or how long it should be. It really depends on the context of the image that we're talking about. So if something is purely aesthetic, if it's just there to complement the content, it can be simple. For example, this panda photo is not really serving a constructive purpose. It's just there for decoration. So I just have close-up of panda face because that's really, that's all that's there. That's all that's being conveyed in that image. Now, say I was doing a report on the facial characteristics of pandas. Then I might want to talk a little bit more because it might be serving a purpose of displaying some of those things that I'm talking about. So I might talk about how it has black ears and white fur on its face with black fur patches around the eyes. So it really depends on the context. When we're describing things like maps, particularly think of, heat maps. If we're talking about diagrams. That's where we start to get, it gets a little bit trickier. So the rule of thumb is whatever you are hoping someone will get from looking at it, if they are a visual learner, that's what you want conveyed in the alt text. So this comes up a lot for data maps. If you have a map, for example, and we are showing where there are more cases of, where the number of COVID cases per county, and it's one of those where we're doing it in ranges. So the darker the color, the more cases there are. We are not expecting someone who is a visual processor to look at that map, identify every county, go to the legend, and try to identify what range it's in. Instead, we're trying to share trends, and that's what you would then describe. You would say, this is a heat map of the distribution of COVID cases across the state. For example, the southeast corner of the state has the highest levels, and I'm just, making some of this up as I go. The UP has the lightest level. So it's trends. You're just trying to convey what is there. If you're talking about something that is analyzed in the body of the document, so we see this a lot with charts or graphs, for example, you don't have to repeat content that exists in the body text of the document. So say we have a bar chart on the rates of different types of disabilities in the state. If I talk about all of those things and all of those data points are talked about in the body text, I don't need to put that in the alt text as well. The person using the screen reader doesn't need to hear it twice. So what you can say is, this is a chart looking at prevalence of different types of disabilities. All data is stated and explained in body of document. So if it's in the document, you don't have to double up, if that makes sense. The only information going in that alt text box should be unique and not available elsewhere. We want to make sure that we're using headings if and when it's appropriate. So these make things a lot easier for a screen reader to navigate through a document for the user. Essentially, headings create an outline format, so it allows them to skim through the document in the same way that we would looking at headings on a document. Word does most of the work for you. All of those options in the upper right side of that home tab, you can see them. We've got normal, heading 1, heading 2. Those are all preset heading formats for you. Now you can change the formatting by right-clicking, and this box that you see here will open up. So my headings on this screenshot look a little bit different than yours because I have customized my headings. You don't have to. Once you have something set as a heading, you can always change the size and color without it affecting that it's categorized as a heading. If your document is more than a couple pages, or if it has multiple distinct sections, you're going to want to use headings. This is really important and very helpful for the user. Headings are also beneficial for you. If you use headings, you can automatically insert a table of contents at the end, and I can absolutely show you how to do that if you're not familiar. So it makes things a little bit easier from an organizational standpoint. But we want to use these anytime we have more than one topic or multiple pages. I'm going to shift over and talk about PowerPoint for a couple of minutes. So with PowerPoint, you need to do everything we've talked about, plus a couple of other things. So first of all slides need a unique title. So titles in PowerPoint are sort of used in lieu of the headings that we were just talking about in Word. It allows a screen reader user to skim through the PowerPoint by just clicking on those titles. All of those titles need to be unique. So if you are presenting on results from a survey, you should not have 3 pages of results where the title is results on the top. They should all be unique. It could be results by age, results by race, results by gender. It could be results -1, results -2. It just has to be a little bit different. The important thing to note is that it has to be there. It doesn't have to be seen. So you can hide the title behind content if you want, or you can set it to not display. That's completely fine because a screen reader will still pick up that title even if you can't visually see it. So you can always have, slide titles that then, if you're doing -1 or by race, by age, you can make that the color of the background so that you just see the word results, but that other piece is still there for the screen reader to pick up. You have to use the designated title boxes, otherwise it's not actually classified as a title. So whenever you insert a new slide, or you pick one of the slide layout options, there's almost always an option that says click to add title. As you can see, the arrows are pointing to 2 examples of that. That's where your title needs to go. The title must be in the title box, or the software does not recognize it as a title. So that's very important. You also need to set the reading order. So what the reading order does is it tells a screen reader, this is what I want you to read first. This is what you read next. This is next. It gives it the order in which to process the elements on the page. Now with Microsoft Word, everything is left to right, top to bottom, because it's an open text software. PowerPoint is not. PowerPoint is an element-based software. So it doesn't naturally read left to right, top to bottom, because we're putting different elements on the page. So to do that, we go to this Arrange button at the top where the dark arrow is pointing. It's got a yellow square with 2 little white squares. We click on that and we click Show Reading Order Panel. Selection pane. Arrange Selection pane. And the Reading Order panel will open up. And that'll look like this other little blue outlined box. Everything that exists on your slide will show up here. And then you need to put it in the correct order. So title you'll want read first, then text, then images. But this is an important thing to remember. The reading order goes from bottom to top. Microsoft does a lot of things well. This is something that they do not do well. The reason it's bottom to top is because it correlates with the layering of elements on a page. And while I recognize that that's why it's there, it is not user-friendly and does not make sense, because naturally we would think the title should be at the top, but title should be at the bottom. So your reading order is bottom to top. You just want to make sure that everything is the order that it should be processed on the screen. When we're working with tables, there's a few things to keep in mind. Now I talked about how text boxes were a big adjustment. Tables are also typically a big adjustment for folks. So tables should be used for data only. They should not be used as a formatting tool. A lot of times I see tables used to create things like agendas, where, in one column you have the times, in the next column you have the topics, and in the third column you maybe have whoever's the lead speaker for that particular topic. That's not data. So for it to be data, it needs to have distinct headers, and it needs to be organizing data in a constructive way to convey it. It doesn't necessarily mean numbers. You can see on the table example on this page, not all of the cells are numbers, but it is still data because there are still headings attached to each column. And you need to specify that header row. That header row needs to be repeated. And in that example table, you'll see an arrow pointing to something that says repeat header rows. That is really important. The table will not be accessible without that. You'll want to add some alt text. You'll right click, you'll go to that table's property like we talked about when we were talking about alt text. Now this doesn't need to be a breakdown of all the data. This is just a general description of what the table is. In that bottom example, it's a table showing certain Harry Potter characters, the house that they're in, and the number that siblings they have. It's simple like that. We don't have to go through and name each data point, but it gives the screen reader user a quick summary of what the table's about. You need to make sure that there are no unused rows or columns. So when people present data that has lots of variables, sometimes they'll do it all in one table and they'll just put a blank line between sections. So we have to not do that. Blank cells don't mean anything to a screen reader. The screen reader doesn't know what to do with that blank cell. We also cannot use any merged or split cells. And this, anybody who works with data this is probably going to be a little bit of an adjustment for you to get used to. A lot of times we are taught, when we're taught data sharing best practices, we're taught to use merged or split cells. That's something that is very, very commonly used. The problem, though, is that a screen reader then doesn't know which columns or rows that those cells are related with, because they span over multiple, and it no longer can read the data in an organized fashion. It doesn't know how to do it. So we have to make sure that there are no merged or split cells. Microsoft does a really great job and has an accessibility checker that you can use. Now, this should never be the only method you're using to check your document. You should still be doing all of your work in a way that you're taking these considerations into account. But this is a really good double check for you as you're finalizing your document. This is only for PC computers right now. As far as I know, they're in the process of trying to roll out the Apple Mac version of this. I don't think it's hit all software versions yet, though. So, if you're working with a Mac, it's very possible that this will not be there. So we go to File Info, check for issues, and the second option down will be check for accessibility, and it'll open this image on the right, this sidebar pane, and it's going to tell you everything, not everything, but it's going to list every error that it finds. Now, there's some things it doesn't catch. It doesn't catch if you're not using sans serif font. It doesn't catch if your bulleted lists are not structured appropriately, but it will catch things like missing alt text. It'll catch things like objects not being in line or table irregularity. So it's a really good way to make sure you didn't miss anything as you were going along. Again, this is for most software versions, it's just in PC right now, but always a good double check. So I talked a little bit about different ways that we could format things while still making them accessible. So here's 3 examples of why I see folks using text boxes or text wrapping. They want to put multiple pictures or objects next to each other. One way to do this in an accessible manner is to put all of the images next to each other and use your snipping tool or a screenshot tool to capture them all as one image. So I see this a lot with logos at the top of documents. If you guys are putting together some kind of handout and you have the state logo and you have the MSHDA logo and you have, a community program logo and you have them all next to each other. That when I see multiple images, it's typically that. So what you can do is you can put them next to each other, use that snipping tool. And if you're not familiar with that tool, let me know at the end and I will show you, and make them one object. You just have to make sure that the alt text that you add includes everything in it. You can also use columns. Columns are fantastic once you get used to using them. They're not super user-friendly when you first start working with them, but there is so much you can do. You can change the width of columns so that they don't have to be the same length. You can put border lines between them. You can do all kinds of things with columns. Sometimes I see text boxes because folks are trying to put multiple pieces of text next to each other. This is common in things like newsletters, where we've got 2 articles next to each other, or we've got a table of contents on the left and the first article on the right. This is another situation in which columns work great. Again, they take a little bit of practice, and I'm always happy to work with folks to get kind of used to that formatting style. That's one way to do that. If you're trying to space things out in a single line, you can use the tab tool. The rule of thumb, though, is you never want to tab more than twice between pieces. I see text boxes a lot for titles or headings because we want to shade them or outline them. You can do all of those things with plain text. You don't need that text box. The fill tool, it's that little button with the bucket of paint on it at the top of your screen. That you can use that fill feature for a single line of text. You can also use the border feature to outline specific text. These are all things that you can do to replicate the look of something that is using text wrapping or text boxes without actually doing so. And again, I mentioned I will provide both this PowerPoint and this guide called Creating Accessible Documents, and all of this and how to do each of these can be found in that document. I'm going to touch briefly on Adobe. So Adobe and PDF accessibility are a completely separate process from Microsoft accessibility, but the more accessible your Microsoft Word document is, the easier it will be to make it accessible once it's a PDF. So having an accessible Word document does not mean it's accessible as a PDF. You have to do this process in both programs. The process for accessibility in Adobe is very different than with Microsoft. So PDFs are tag-based, kind of similar to how PowerPoint is, where it's different elements on a page. But it means you have to go through and make sure everything is tagged as the appropriate element and that it's in the right order. The other catch is that Adobe will frequently run the checker and show that there's no errors, even though there are, because it thinks it's done it the way you want, but it hasn't, and you have to go in and hand check these things. So I do offer trainings on Adobe. It's a little more extensive and it's a little more difficult, but I am happy to do that as well. It is important to know that you can only do this accessibility work in advanced Adobe software, so Adobe Pro or Adobe DC. Adobe Reader, because it's a read-only software, there's no editing capabilities. You can't do accessibility work there. So, at least over in MDHHS, for a lot of programs, that's a major barrier because not everyone has that advanced software by default. I have it, and a couple of other folks do, but it's not something that's just standard on the computers. So if you don't have advanced Adobe software, PDF accessibility gets a little tricky. So that's what I have for content. So at this point, I am going to open it up for questions. I'm going to exit out of sharing so that I can see everybody. But then I am also happy to demonstrate if there's anything in particular where you were like, oh, caught that, but I didn't quite catch how to do it. I'm happy to walk through how to do that in a document. I know it's a little bit harder because we're doing this virtually, and normally I would have a screen up and be able to walk through all of this. So, bear with me as we try to demonstrate as best we can.
Hi, Alice. This is Matthew Shaner. I've got some questions for you.
Perfect.
First, thanks for taking the time today. This has been very informative. So one question, you had mentioned back when you were talking about the links. So I'm the digital marketing manager for the Authority, and so Tony and I both we do most of the web work for the Authority, and so I loved what you said about getting rid of the click here's, and Tony, guess what we're going to be doing next week. So that was very helpful. But and then you gave some examples of like the really long URLs that Vignette naturally does, and then you gave an example of like something that's titled properly, right?
Yes.
But then you mentioned that a link shortener was an appropriate way of dealing with this as well. But wouldn't a screen reader still just read a bunch of characters, even though it was a shorter amount of characters? Wouldn't a screen reader still deal with that?
Yes, I'm sorry. Maybe I was not. That's my fault for not being clear. So you would only use the link shortener if you're working on a document that's available both electronically and in hard copy, or just hard copy. If it's only electronically, you're always going to have that unique hyperlink. But if you need to include the URL in parentheses next to it, that's when you would use the link shortener.
Gotcha.
Does that make
sense?
I
might have, yeah, absolutely. Okay. I might have mentally blinked and missed that part. So, second question. So we've got a number of offices around the Authority who have gotten savvy with preparing PowerPoint presentations, and they'll put their audio clips to those PowerPoint presentations, and then we export those as an MP4 and we put those up on YouTube for broader dissemination. So we just give them an unlisted link. Obviously, by turning these into videos, we are totally destroying any ADA compliancy efforts that might have actually gone into the slide deck, right?
Yep.
And so what is the recommended practice? So like we could still go through the hoop of uploading the PowerPoint presentation and then linking to it, under the YouTube description. Is that the accepted notion, or is there something else that you would recommend for tackling that?
So typically, if you're uploading, if you're taking the slides and the audio and you're putting them on YouTube, we're no longer dealing with a slide deck. We're now dealing with a video, if I'm understanding correctly. And video accessibility is a little bit different. So it's not necessarily such that you then have to link to the PowerPoint. You just have to treat it as an accessible video. YouTube is a pretty good platform to work with because they auto caption things for you. So that's the biggest is captioning. We want there to be captioning attached to those videos. YouTube typically does that. It's always good to watch through with the YouTube captions on and try to catch any errors, because while YouTube does it, they don't always do it well. And you can manually fix some of those captions. The other recommendation that I often have is that you either include a link to the base material or a transcript that's included. So for somebody who can't see the captions, they can always use the transcript to be able to listen to them with the audio. So that would be my recommendation. If we're treating it as a video, then just make sure that the captions are clear and accurate, and that you have a transcript to accompany it that's available in the video information section.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't have any questions right now. I'm trying to just take in all the information that you shared, which was extremely interesting and beneficial. And I look forward to getting the copy of the slides as reminders and refreshers. And just really appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
You're so welcome. And I recognize that while the content I gave you may be interesting, it may also be very overwhelming right now. Some folks have been introduced to document accessibility before, in which case this might not feel like a ton of new content. But if you've never heard of document accessibility, if it's never been talked about, what I just talked about is very different than the standard practice of what we're used to. And it's, document accessibility is not something that's brought up in commonplace. We're getting better about it now because we're recognizing that it's an access issue, and there's a little bit better enforcement happening. But yes, I do 100% recognize that this may be a whole lot of new information for lots of you, and I'm always happy to come back. I'm always happy to work one-on-one with folks. Whatever ways I can be most helpful to you.
Thank you. I do have one quick follow-up question. What is the recommended software reader program? We have a board member who is visually impaired, and he's been using JAWS.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that is still the recommended software, or if you feel there's a better industry kind of standard for that.
So, it's not necessarily that one software is better than the other. So JAWS is the most common commercial screen reader used, particularly by professionals in the workplace. So I have JAWS on my computer because I have taken classes in JAWS to be able to test documents. And so because JAWS is kind of the more common one, that's what I use. NVDA is probably the next most common. I typically don't recommend that you go and experiment with screen readers without some base level knowledge of how they work, just because they're very complex software systems, and they're all keystroke and shortcut based. So you have to memorize hundreds of keystrokes.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not used to using them, it can cause more confusion than it is helpful.
Okay.
But NVDA is free to state employees on the Software Center. So it's something that, if you want to learn how to use them a little bit for testing, things like that, that one is available for free. Again, I like testing documents with screen readers when I check them for folks, but it is a process to learn how to use them. So I want to add that kind of little side note there.
Right.
But JAWS and NVDA seem to be the most common. So Adobe and I believe Microsoft also has a built-in read aloud feature, and that is not comparable to a screen reader. That's the one thing that I would say is that is very different because it's built into the software. So it functions very differently than a screen reading software does.
Okay, thank you.
So, Alice, this is Matthew again.
Yeah.
So you've alluded to checking documents for folks a couple times now. Could you maybe share with us, I don't know whether it's you or your whole office, do you folks do any kind of auditing for other agencies where we could say, maybe Mary would want you folks to audit a board meeting, a Michigan board meeting, just to see how we could make it more ADA compliant, or if we had several presentations or documents, or had a process, would you be willing to look at a process or something like that to say, yep, you guys are on course, or no, you're all way off in the bushes?
Sure. So I will preface by saying my program is me. So there are not the disability public health program is very small. What I do with document accessibility is not it's part of my actual job, but it's also kind of this secondary piece because there is not really anybody in state departments designated to do this work. The goal is that every department will at some point have a digital accessibility person, expert, consultant, whatever you want to call it. But for now, there's not. So I am happy to check documents for folks. I always ask that you give it your best shot and then we look at it. I'm not going to do all the accessibility work for you, but I will certainly, if it's something that needs some work, we can schedule a time and walk through how to do it because, I certainly want to help folks learn how to do it as opposed to just, doing it for you. In terms of things like meetings and whatnot, I do trainings in, meeting and event accessibility and in disability cultural competency. And so I'm happy to do anything in those areas as well, even if it means kind of watching how you host virtual events, if it's a board meeting and kind of walking through some of the best practices there. I'm happy to just provide the blanket trainings in those areas too. But yeah, no, I'm more than happy to work with folks. What I don't typically do is website audits, just because web accessibility is a very different thing. That's DTMB's job. And, most websites in the state have thousands of documents on them. So that is not something I do. Audit is also a strong word. For what I do, because I don't have enforcement. I am not the accessibility, enforcement person. I can certainly provide feedback. I can certainly help make them accessible, but I don't have any kind of legal authority to say you need to fix these by this point in time. So I am more of a technical assistance resource than I am that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is Clarence. I thank you for clarifying that. When I heard the word audit, that made me nervous. Please don't use. Please
no,
do not
audit is not what I do.
Reporting, we are not asking for an audit.
Right. Sorry, Clarence.
Yeah, I second that.
I haven't done trouble sleeping. I don't need other reasons.
Yes, all of legal. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, I do not do anything with legal. I can educate on legal requirements, under the law. I can certainly do all of that. I do not enforce. Yeah.
But we certainly, I want to support Matt's request. We certainly would welcome getting feedback from you on how we can improve. Sure.
Yeah, and I'm always happy to do that, whether it be through trainings, whether it be through reviewing things that you have. Anything like that. Yep. Is there anything that I talked about that you'd like me to demonstrate?
Can I, Alice, this is Tara. I just have a question in regards to some of our marketing materials.
Sure.
So I know that some of our individual departments are doing their own marketing materials, and I'm wondering, do we just take the information that we sent to you, because some of us do it in-house and then also work with individuals outside to help us put those pieces together.
Okay.
Would it be to our benefit to send your information to them and just make sure that we are following that compliance that way?
So
What would your
yeah, I suppose that depends. If it's something you're doing internally, I can look at it. When you're working with, say you're contracting with an outside company. So, MDHHS uses Brogan a lot. I don't know what organizations, companies, persons you might be working with. You are well within your rights when you are making that agreement with them to say that accessibility is an expectation. A lot of those companies should be aware of it. They should know how to do it. Whether or not they actually do it seems to be kind of hit or miss. So if you're contracting with somebody outside, have that conversation with them up front. Part of the problem, part of why you want to have that conversation up front is a lot of times I see that, documents that come to me for review were created outside of Microsoft. They were created in things like Canva. I don't know if any of you, work with Canva. And Canva is very difficult to convert to PDF and make accessible because it's a different, company that does it. For example, not all the fonts that you use in Canva are recognized by Adobe. And so then we have text that's not being processed and it becomes a whole thing. So that's why, I always say up front, have that conversation with them. And to make sure that process is being done well. If you ever have, agreements with folks and they say, well, this is where we're going to create it and this is how we're going to do it, and you're not sure about the accessibility of that, feel free to send me an email. I certainly don't have experience in all programs, but there are some that I know cause problems down the line. If you're working with folks within the state, you are more than welcome to give them my contact information. That is completely fine. I'm cautious when we get to outside because then we get back into that legal requirement kind of world, and it's not. I can provide best practices, but I cannot provide legal advice. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. And that for sure helps with the clarity on it. I just wanted to double check and make sure. So thank you for that.
Yeah, sorry if that was kind of a non-answer.
No, it makes perfect sense. So thank you.
Yeah. So my contact information is available in the slides and the guidance documents. Tony, is it okay if I send both of those to you and you then distribute them?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yep. And if anybody has questions, if anybody has feedback on any of them, please let me know. The guidance document is pretty continually evolving. As technology changes, as updates happen, as new features are created, we try to keep that up to date, but sometimes things get missed. So, if you're ever looking at the document and the screenshots don't match what you're seeing on the screen, let me know. Because certainly it's something I can help with, and it's something that we can make sure gets updated appropriately. But yeah, I'm here as a resource. I'm always happy to do PDF accessibility work with you. Any of the other trainings, disability cultural competency, accessible, meetings, things like that. However I can best be a resource.